Hello, fellow travelers, and welcome to the Traversing the Stars podcast. How are my loyal listeners? Thank you for your continued support. As always, hit that subscribe button, everybody. We have an amazing show for you because boarding the mothership is Dan Waters. You know him as the writer of Lucifer and Homesick Pilots. He currently writes The Sword of Azrael from DC comic books. Now come join me as we go traversing the stars. Hello, Mr. Waters. Thank you so much for coming to the Traversing the Stars podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me, Jeff.
Totally my pleasure, sir. It's always a pleasure to talk with you.
Yeah, likewise.
So I always like to start off with a question of inspiration. So what inspired you to become a writer and who were your earliest influences?
Oh boy. The things I kind of always go back, I mean, at least especially with comics, why I wanted to do comics, it was the Claremont Miller Wolverine and Graham Higgins' adaptation of Terry Pratchett's Mort, which I got given on the same day when I was very young, and they were both insane things that I couldn't believe existed. And it was my introduction to Terry Pratchett, who would probably also be one of the sort of reasons that I thought that this was, he was one of those writers that I looked at, and he did all these things and he had all these tricks, and he just also at the same time made it feel like he was someone sat there telling you a story.
So over the years, so when you decided to become a writer, how did you develop your skills to become a writer?
I always liked it when I was a kid. I used to write stories. I used to write stories and draw pictures and stuff all the time. I always liked to come out of any sort of downtime I had having produced something. I just like making things, I think. And I guess that kind of just led to. I mean, I had quite a few years where I didn't do anything like that. Puberty hit quite hard, and there were certainly other interests, mainly around like electric guitars and video games and social things. But yeah, once I sort of came back to it, I started studying film at university, hated it.
Yeah.
Switched to comparative literature, which is once I started doing that and started getting into sort of like clever things that people were doing and interesting, exciting things, I wanted to be a part of that. So I started writing again with sort of seriousness. I'd always sort of dabbled and messed around with stuff, but yeah, I think, yeah, I just started writing, and I started writing tons of stuff, and I've always had the sort of belief that most things work through sort of some form of muscle memory, in terms of you have to do a load of bad stuff before you can do something good. So I've always taken the attitude of like, well, let's try and get some of that out of the way.
So what didn't you like about film theory or criticism?
Well, I think it was the fact that it was geared towards criticism rather than making. It was kind of sold as being both, but I mean, this was also a couple of years ago, and it was a sort of early days sort of film studies thing where they were still trying to kind of work out what it was, like at that university at least. So yeah, it just didn't quite gel with me. I didn't find it kind of dense enough or practical enough, I guess.
I mean, you've amassed an amazing career as a comic book writer. I think when your better known series was Lucifer, that was a continuation of the Mike Carey story. That was a continuation of Neil Gaiman's story.
Somewhat the continuation.
Right. So, what was that experience like, and how is it to write a character that has been written by by other writers and successfully by those writers?
Well, the way I kind of had to look at it, especially because I was sort of handed that book. I still don't quite know how I got away with that. I'd only done a few things, and then they approached me. I mean, obviously, someone at DC liked them, and they approached me for that book. So I was, I hadn't done any sort of like one shots or superhero stories or anything like that. Um, they just sort of asked me if I had any ideas for Lucifer, and I thought it was a very exciting prospect. The way I had to kind of look at it in terms of following writers like Gaiman and Carey is that Lucifer's also one of the one of the characters who's been written about probably the most in the Western canon.
Hmm.
So you could sort of freak yourself out by thinking you're going to be compared to Gaiman and Carey, but you're also going to be compared to Milton
Yep.
and Dante and Bulgakov, and so once you sort of start couching it in those terms, you can either be paralyzed by it and say, well, it's a character that we've been writing about forever, and we will probably continue to write about forever in some form or other, as long as there's sort of people on the planet will be scared of something that lurks in the dark judging us.
Hmm. Now,
So that was my take.
now, when you started writing for Lucifer, did you go back and reread the earlier stories of from Vertigo about the character?
Oh yeah. I mean, I loved all that stuff anyway. That was the stuff that kind of brought me back into comics when I was sort of a later teen. I went to the sort of like local library and they had a ton of Sandman and Lucifer, and it was all out of sequence, and I just read whatever I could get my hands on. So I'd read a lot of it already. I'd read Sandman, pretty religiously. I went back, and it was a good excuse to go back and reread it all.
Well,
But I also knew that I also knew that I wanted to take what was kind of seeded there and take it in very different directions.
now, when you wrote Lucifer, once again, it was a very different take, a little bit on Lucifer, as far as
Hmm.
the character for Lucifer was originally written in the 90s in a very Neil Gaiman kind of cerebral way. I think you added more um, forward momentum to the character. So was that
What, sorry?
forward momentum? You gave him a little
Oh.
more action oriented, a little less contemplative. Um,
You mean I had him tearing more heads off?
yes, I mean, there's a little more action to the character. My memory of Lucifer from my Carrie's series as well was that very little. I mean, he didn't do that much. It was more like discussing and talking, and he was kind of things happened around him a little bit more. You're more, I think, he was more had a direction and more action directed towards that character. Where was that the idea? It was because to make Lucifer a little bit more of a leading type character, a little less of a Hamlet type character.
Um, I think what I wanted to, because if you look at something like that, so yes, like we were just talking about, like there's what Gaiman did with him, there's what Carey did with him. So I saw my job as looking at that and going, okay, what hasn't been explored with this character but is intrinsic to him? And for me, that a lot of that was about looking at the folklore and the sort of stories that we've been telling about him for a long time, and how those sort of fit into this version of Lucifer. So I guess I think yes, he is quite central to a lot of the stories, and he spends time sort of making deals and sort of experimenting with humanity at times, and going forward and backwards in time, like sort of because Terry's book's quite linear. It goes directly forward from where Sandman leaves off.
Yep.
I wanted to jump around a little bit more and explore a little bit more of his history. So I guess it's still the same Lucifer, but we're seeing the parts where he was, dressing up in armor and doing the wild hunt and tricking peasant farmers and all that kind of thing.
So you have written both Lucifer and also Azrael. Both characters are very much steeped in religion. Obviously, um, religious texts going back, and obviously Sword of Saint Dumas with Azrael. Is that at all intimidating? Do you have to be careful how you approach it for either the readers or editors of the project?
Um, Not massively. I was sort of raised with this with and around this faith. Like, you know, both I've learned quite heavily on the Catholicism, and I went to a very Catholic school, and they'd sort of put us out of class to send us to mass and all that kind of stuff on a regular basis. So it's something I've been steeped in my whole life, and therefore it's something that I'm interested in writing about and that I want to write about. And you know, I'm interested in what makes it tick, and what makes it survive, and all these sort of things. What makes it so important to so many people? Because it's easy to sort of just punch at religion a lot, and but it's very important to a lot of people. But it also has, you know, done horrific things, you know, particularly about the Catholic Church in all sorts of ways. So it's a complex, dense, sticky thing, and those are the most interesting things to writers, I think.
Well, like I said, when you're writing Azrael, or otherwise known as Jean Paul Valley,
Yes.
are you approaching him as if he is a strong believer of faith? Is he driven by faith, or is it faith in Christianity or faith in the Order of Saint Dumas, which is slightly different, and how, depending on your perspective?
Yeah, I mean the Order of Saint Dumas is an offshoot of the Knights Templar, who were a Catholic organization, and were, you know, very sort of powerful in the Middle Ages, and then were decimated by the French royalty because they become too powerful and they become a threat. So that history is something that hasn't ever been sort of explored with Azrael, and that's something I'm interested in getting into, at least in some aspect. Because there's a hell of a lot of baggage there, and a lot of pain, and you know, horrible things that were done. There's also John Paul's faith is something I'm very interested in. With something we established in the 30-page story, which is also being reprinted for for August, that Nicola and I did as a sort of precursor to this book. The idea that John Paul has sort of found faith in a more traditional sense, and how that contrasts with the beliefs of Azrael, which is, you know, something he's programmed with. It's the system within him which sort of ignites when he puts on the costume, and believes it is a avenging angel that must do the will of the Order of Saint Dumas, which is the true, you know, path of God. So the contrast between that and John Paul's like growing New Testament faith is exactly the kind of thing that I want to explore in the book.
Now, like I said, going with the idea of exploring his faith, once again, the people, he's connected to the Knights Templar, which, as you said, were destroyed by French, and for many different reasons, who were, you know, very steeped in religion, the Knights Templar. You have what happened with him as Azrael in the Order, that, and which is done by people who, once again, believe, or at least profess to believe very strongly in God and religion. How bad does that shake his beliefs as individual within that faith?
I don't know. I think that's something that anyone with faith has had to sort of deal with in some way, some way, shape, or form. You know, like Christianity has been something that's been splitting and squabbling and dividing pretty much since the day it was formed.
So when you started writing Dark Knight of the Soul as a backup story to Batman Urban Legends, did you already know when you started it that it was about to be spun off into this 6-issue miniseries, Sword of Azrael?
No. That we sort of like lived in hope, but the idea with that was to sort of go, you know, it was a way for sort of DC to go like, oh, is there something here? Is this a character we want to explore with more depth and take a bit further? So it was that story which kind of developed into us being able to do this series.
And, you know, interesting thing about Azrael is that he's had a very complicated journey in the world of comic books. He was part of the Order of Saint Dumas, became Batman, became Agent of the Bat. He was then replaced with Michael Lane. Where does the Sword of Azrael series that you're writing take place within that complicated history, and which parts of that continuity still hold?
All of it.
All of it, okay.
Pretty simple answer. Yeah. He's been around. He's been around since Rebirth as well. He was in Detective Comics for a while and a few other places. So as far as we're concerned, everything happened, and we're picking up from now.
Well, one interesting about Azrael is that he has also a complicated history with Batman, where he both wanted to pull away from Batman completely, but also once again the Agent of the Bat part, where he wanted to prove himself in the eyes of Batman. So where is he in that conflict?
I mean, so John Paul also in Order of the World, which is the story I did after Dark Knight of the Soul, Arkham City Order of the World, which was a 6-issue series where he basically spent most of it trying to track down Arkham Asylum escapees and essentially brutalize them. So that's the last thing he did in Gotham before we pick up this series, and the Azrael part of him very much took over. He was sort of duped into believing he was following an angel, which was not quite that. So he has gotten the hell out of Dodge as far as Batman is concerned. He's pretty ashamed and pretty shocked at himself.
So in the Sword of Azrael series, obviously the second one, the original, obviously is from the 90s with Joe Quesada. Does Batman make an appearance in the series?
In the series we're telling now?
Yes.
No, this isn't a Gotham story or a Batman story. This is very much about John Paul, and his figuring out his own history and who he is going to be going forward.
Well, I would say, speaking for the fans of Azrael, thank you. I find that Azrael has had a long history of trying to get out of the shadow of Batman, of the character, just not just within the context of the story, but just within the context of DC comic books. And I think it's nice to see that he is pulling away completely from Batman.
Yeah, I mean, I like the relation. I think the relationship between them is very interesting because he sees Batman as another sort of father figure. He can't really get out from under father figures between his own father, who was the last Azrael, who he found out he was Azrael when his father turned up bleeding on his dorm room floor, and then Saint Dumas himself, and all the way from there to Batman, who he also tried to usurp and dethrone. So yeah, it's an interesting relationship, but I just don't. Not every story has to be about that.
He does seem to have some sort of father complex.
Definitely. I mean, show me a Catholic who doesn't.
I didn't even think about that. So one aspect, once again, as you mentioned about Azrael, is the relationship he has with the system that kind of can take control over him. Now, depending on the continuity, I think in the ongoing Azrael series, eventually he worked his way out of that issue. If my memory serves of it, is he fully in control of the system? The system still have control over him?
It goes back and forth. I think is the sort of defining thing about Azrael. I do find it. I don't know if I should say this on the podcast. I'm going to say it. And then I'll work out whether I want to say it.
No worries.
One thing I do find kind of funny is that there are. I will sometimes see people go sort of like, I wish he was just in control of the system, and he just was able to sort of heal and have power over that. But it's the thing that makes Azrael, rather than a dozen other characters dressed up in spandex and Kevlar. I mean, it's that and the flaming sword. But the system, I think, is a core part of what he is, and battling with that is key to the story we're telling as well. We're going into the system in a big way as well in this story and what it actually is and how it actually got there. That's something I'm really excited to get into in this story.
So, I mean, the superhero aspect of Azrael does come from the system. Where does the heroic aspect of Azrael come from? Is Jean Paul Valley still a hero without the system? What part of him is the hero?
I mean, I don't know if you. I don't know if he's a hero with the system at all. It sort of tells him to go and brutalize people
well,
for
well,
the financial gain of the Order of the Saint Dumas,
right,
which
right.
I'm not on.
Well, that makes him the superhero hero part of it, but the hero aspect is, I would imagine, in him somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes he wants to be a good person. I think the fact that he's someone who wants to be a good person, but battles with this impulse to do terrible things, is makes him pretty human. And battling that is, I guess, maybe the closest he gets to heroic.
Much of the Azrael story, especially in his ongoing series, which was very good, is him running away from the Order of Saint Dumas. What is the relationship with the Order now? Because in urban legend, it seems a little bit like he's searching for others like the Order or maybe the Templar. Does Jean Paul wish the Order reformed? What would that? Where is he in his relationship with the Order?
Well, he wiped them out in that run. He massacred them, which is something that hasn't really been dealt with either, in terms of his behavior under the mask. They created him as their sort of angel of vengeance, and then he judged them unworthy. So that's something that he is going to have to face at some point, I think. But them being gone is generally a good thing as well, and he knows that.
Because of the violence that he creates, because of the system as Azrael, is he able to separate the guilty, the idea of himself from that? In other words, does he still feel the guilt of what he does, even though he's not fully in control when he does it?
Um, to an extent, yes, he does. He does define between himself and Azrael, to a point, Azrael's behavior and his behavior, but he knows it's still his hands.
So, doing the artwork for the book is Nicola, on the Sword of Azrael miniseries. What does his talents bring to the table, and did that at all inform how you approached the scripts, knowing what he's capable of?
Yeah, yeah, in a really big way, actually. Nicola is one of the best action artists I've seen, and that I've worked with, and that meant I knew that when we were coming back to do this story, I wanted to put a whole load of really big, explosive action scenes. As all good superhero books should have. But I really sort of pushed that side of my writing, and gave him a load of freedom to sort of draw people punching and stabbing and fire and all that kind of stuff.
So, I Sword of Azrael is a 6-issue miniseries. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Is there talk of it becoming an ongoing from the 6th issue, or is it just going to be 6 issues?
6 issues for now.
But hopefully more than that at some point.
We'll see. Yeah, I don't think I would like to not be done with Azrael yet.
I must say, because I really do love the character of Azrael. I bought the ongoing. I liked him. I must admit, I might be one of the people who love Night Quest a lot. I really was a big fan of that storyline. Yeah, and I kind of feel like at some point character got lost sometime after the ongoing ended. Why do you think the character has still though maintained that fan base for even with the company seeming to have lost the character a little bit after that series ended?
It's a tough question. I don't know. Like he's not always like characters like this aren't always the easiest ones to write. They demand a lot of attention, in terms of page space. So putting them in sort of team books and stuff is pretty difficult because he's inclined to sort of go off and do his own thing and go off the rails and all that sort of thing. But I don't know. He's a character I've always loved, and it's been interesting to see. There was a real response that I wasn't necessarily expecting, at least on that scale, when we announced the book.
Yeah,
people seem very excited, which is really cool.
Does Michael Lane have a role in this book as well?
Not in this story, no. That's not something we're addressing here. We've only got 6 issues.
so far, only 6.
So far.
So where and when can our listeners find Sword of Azrael?
2nd of August, in all good comic shops. Hopefully all comic shops.
Well, Mr. Bordeaux, I want to thank you so much. Like I said, I think Azrael is one of the coolest characters. On my autograph wall, I definitely have some Mike Quest covers on there.
It's fantastic. That's right.
Yeah,
are those Kelly's?
Yeah, I got Kelly Jones's autograph on one.
I love Kelly's work so much.
It really is impressive. That night, that Asbat suit, the original Asbat suit, before they changed it, it's badass. It's so badass. But well, yeah, that's what I appreciate you bringing Sword of Azrael back to DC Comics, and hopefully it positions him back as a character who'll get
Yeah, me too. You too. Thanks, Jeff.